So I would like to start by having you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay, so my name is Emily Gillespie. I'm a writer. I mainly write fiction, but I keep telling everybody I never stay in my art category, so that's expanding. I'm interested in the intersection of art, especially storytelling and social justice. How can writing be used to have difficult conversations, to explore topics that, sometimes don't quite fit into academics or into other spaces. So I'm really interested in kind of that challenging piece with art. What else to say? I published one novel called Dancing with Ghosts. I have another published short story that I won a contest in a year ago by the Ontario Book Publishers Association. And the piece that you're reading in the anthology is part of a novel I'm working on.
Awesome, thank you. So how did you hear about Nothing Without Us, and how did you feel when you heard about it?
Okay, so I actually know that answer to that question. I saw it on Facebook. I'm really active in a lot of authors groups on social media, and also the disability community. So I'm not sure where it kind of popped up first. I saw it on Facebook. I saw it on Twitter. I was really excited because I'm interested in matching the right story with the right home. So when I read the call for submissions, I actually showed it to a few of my friends who aren't writers, just because I thought it was so great, laughing about, we don't want your inspiration porn. It's good. I don't want a publisher that's looking for that to have my work, because it's very important for me when I'm, writing about social issues, that it gets to the right audience. So I read and printed that column, threw it on my fridge, and went, this is where I feel my story belongs. I'm interested, some of my background too is gender studies and media studies, and thinking about representation. What does representation look like, not just in, academic journals and in policy spaces, but also in media, in fiction and film. So excited to see this disability anthology. And I had this story, and I submitted it one other place. And as soon as I saw your call, I couldn't wait to get the rejection letter, which I got in time because it was more fitting for this place. So it's fun to follow along on the social media, and, regardless of if I got in, it was an anthology I was excited to get my hands on.
In terms of representation of people with disabilities in the media in general, and specifically in fiction, how would you qualify that representation?
What are my thoughts on what that representation looks like?
Yeah.
I think that's so broad, especially if you're thinking about different types of disabilities. People might end up being the, basic inspirational story, or the victim, or it becomes about the caregivers, and aren't they so great for, looking after their disabled partner or disabled parent. So there's, that kind of praise. I also think there's so much pressure to, both in the media and in real life, to be better. You can't be just another average person. You can't just be going about having a regular life. You need some above and beyond story. So I think that's there. When I'm thinking about mental health, I don't think there's room for nuances a lot of times, both in fiction and nonfiction stories we hear. So someone's either I came across the term recently, the recovery superhero. They've done it all. They used to have an addiction. They used to struggle with mental illness. They used all the medical supports, and now they're better, and everyone should be like them and should accomplish so much. So it feels like there's that narrative. Or that you're kind of written off by society and you're super sick and nothing you say makes sense. So I don't think in some spaces there's room for that person who's between, who's maybe struggling, but also a person with a lot of agency, also aware of the politics that surround, mental health or any mental health or any health system. So I'm really interested in those like between spaces where someone's not like completely better and also not completely without awareness or without agency in those choices. So that's my rambling answer.
Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Okay. So this short story is part of a novel I'm writing, and the main character, Jade, is experiencing a mental health crisis and trying to navigate that. So one of her friends, V, is very concerned and comes with her to the ER, and Jade's trying to figure out what's happening. Is this a physical health issue? Did I hit my head? Is this mental health? So it's rapidly getting worse. And then her friend, people have limited capacities. Her friend has to leave for work. And Jade's left there kind of advocating by herself. And ultimately, the ER doesn't really know what to do with her. She doesn't kind of quickly fit into a solution they have. So they don't have the capacity and the resources, and they just let her go. And in this story, I'm flipping between first and second point of view, trying to allow the reader to experience Jade's mental health crisis with her. So kind of adding those layers of disassociation and disorientation in the ER, which is, a very familiar setting, I think, for a lot of disabled folks.
Can you tell me a little bit more about why you think it's important to have representation in fiction specifically?
In fiction? Okay. Such a broad question, I think this goes back to the comment I made before. For mental health in fiction and for disability in fiction, is that it's so... We don't see ourselves represented. So I do think that's so important to see experiences that resonate with us. Like, for instance, my first book also explores the mental health system as well as domestic violence in fiction. And so many people turned to me and said, you know what, I haven't read something that resonated with me like this before. So I think it's so important for the community, while not writing about everybody, for people to see pieces that resonate with their experience. I also think it's important to fiction allows people to explore empathy, to have access to knowledge that they wouldn't otherwise. So for instance, a quick story of someone getting rejected from the ER, you might not understand everything that happened. You might not understand how somebody was feeling, how people did try to advocate for themselves. So for instance, people often the response is, oh, you didn't say the right thing, or you didn't use the right tone, or like there's so much kind of defense of why people didn't get medical supports. So I think fiction's a really interesting place to try to help a reader into a character's shoes and understand what navigating mental health or health services in general look like in crisis. I think fiction's so important too, because a lot of places can have nice shiny websites and nice brochures and nice grant paperwork, but I think fiction is an interesting place to kind of guide a reader, guide someone through this might be what a real experience of navigating this health institution actually looks like beyond billboard campaigns. This is, a space to have these conversations. And I think, fiction allows for a lot of exploration and a lot of reflection. So I think it's, it's good for people with that lived experience to feel like they're represented, but also for folks who might not really have stopped and questioned that medical model or that charity model of the medical system to actually see what it might be like.
You spoke a little bit earlier about the politics of the ER, and can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I went to York and did a degree in disability studies and actually got to be a TA and did a class on the healthcare class I was TAing was on emergency room management. So fascinating. But anyway, I think when you walk into an ER as a person with disabilities, it really automatically feels like you're in a screenplay for me. You're already in a movie or something. How you talk, what you're wearing, everything feels like it's very quickly judged. They say you have like a few seconds to make an impression on someone at a job interview, and I think that holds so true in an ER, especially in a mental health crisis. You end up telling the same story over and over again. People decide how believable you are or aren't. A huge part of it, I think, comes down to funding. You hear people talking about how many beds are free that night. Often, I hear so many, a lot of my friends talk about their emergency room experiences, and sometimes the same thing will happen, and people will be treated in very, very different ways. So, for instance, one person's going to get formed for something rather formed, rights taken away for 48 hours in the mental health system. Someone might get formed for something, and another person, totally wouldn't. It comes down to education, it comes down to race, and I think it often just comes down to who's working that day, what vibe they get off of a person, how believable they think they are, and, what resources are there. And also, this is something else that was interesting, is what research topics are trending. So, for instance, going back to specifically mental health, certain mental illnesses have different research funding behind them at different points. So, what resources are available are directly correlated with that. And I do think that shapes, whether or not someone gets a bed, whether or not someone gets onto a wait list. Yeah. And it's also, too, so, how people are treated. If someone's there with you, if you have a friend or someone advocating with you and there's a witness versus, if people are kind of viewed as outcasts of society and are there by themselves, how they're treated, looks very differently as well. It almost feels like this whole, all of societal politics, I feel, play out in ER rooms, especially mental health ER rooms. There's a lot there. But...
Oh yeah, we could definitely do an hour on that.
Oh, for sure. Societal lessons, sitting in KMH ER. Probably gotta cut that out. I think stigma is a huge impact on who gets what services in the ER system. So, thinking about how believable is somebody, did we already try to help you? That comes up a lot. And I've watched so many people struggle as well, sitting there waiting for your turn, watching people and hearing, well, we already tried to help you a few months ago. You didn't want our help. You didn't perform in a way according to our system. You didn't get better. And I think that comes up. And also, when I've, I end up overhearing a lot of conversations, but some of the people who have the most stigmatizing, dehumanizing views on mental health end up being folks who work in the ER rooms. So what does that mean when you end up being that person sitting across from one of them in crisis? And I really do think that those judgments, whether or not they're conscious or unconscious, really do shape aside from dollars, who gets care and who they decide is worth helping.
Absolutely. And this expectation of you didn't put in the work, you didn't get better. If someone was coming in with a failing heart, they wouldn't refuse to treat them because they didn't get better the last time.
Yeah. And then there's layers of politics too around, what treatments are trending and what getting better looks like. And if you are succeeding according to I just read a book on Mad People's History. It's, continually changing trends in mental health care. But, if you're doing well according to their standards and they decide you're a worthy citizen. So, for instance, this is a complete side note, but one time when I was advocating to get a psychiatrist, and I eventually did get one just because they realized that, I was going to keep calling them back, telling them about my human rights until I got through, and they realized it was going to be a bigger problem than not. But one of the reasons, the secretary, I had such a weird political experience with her because I liked her. In another world, we would have been friends. We always chatted about TV and this and that going in. And she went, "You're always polite to me and you're always nice to me." And I totally think that interpersonal relationship, that she thought I was a good person, impacted the fact that I actually got healthcare. And I'm both aware of that and critical of that, and also, sometimes you end up having to use those things. So that's just, another little example of what people decide they make
yeah.
of you as a person influences what healthcare you do and don't have access to. Like, if that secretary didn't think I was cool, I still might not have a psychiatrist.
Oh yeah, definitely. And the way that you behave at the ER really determines what kind of care you'll get and what kind of treatment you'll get, which is just unfathomable when you think about it. You're going there in a mental health crisis so severe you have to go to the emergency room and you're expected to behave perfectly.
But if you behave too well, they think you're not in crisis or that you don't need support. So for instance, I've gone in, I've had all sorts of physical and mental and all sorts of different reasons I land in the ER. It's just a thing. But if you're too articulate, if you know your rights, if you advocate, if you ask, sometimes I've said, I straight up don't trust you, and I'm bringing someone in with me. And the fact that you're aware of what's happening and the fact that you advocate sometimes is also used against you. You're too smart. You can, you don't need our help. So it always feels like you're, it's perfect for fiction because it already feels like you've entered into a space where you're just supposed to perform a certain way. So those are my thoughts on politics and mental health.
All right, I have one last question for you.
Sure.
Where can people find you and your work?
Okay. So the easiest place to follow me is on Facebook. If you put in Emily, Emily Gillespie, Gillespie, I have a page. I also have Twitter under the same name, and a website. If you Google me, I should actually pop up. My novel, Dancing with Ghosts, is on Amazon, and it's actually also in the library. So you can search me, and I should be there. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.